The auctioneer called them dog food. 47 bone-thin sows, shaking in the November sleet. Everyone laughed when Cora raised her paddle. They didn't see the bloodline. They didn't see the desperation. Months later, those same laughing men would be standing in a mile-long line, begging for a single taste. The Miller's Point livestock auction smelled like stale ammonia, cheap chewing tobacco, and quiet desperation. It was a smell Cora knew in her marrow. The wind howled off the plains, rattling the corrugated tin roof of the holding barn, but the chill inside came from something deeper. It was 2008. The banks were pulling lines of credit like weeds, and every man in the bleachers was doing mental math to figure out how many months they had left before the foreclosure signs went up. Cora sat in the third row. Her canvas coat was frayed at the cuffs, and the soles of her boots were worn smooth. She was 34, but the deep lines around her eyes made her look a decade older. Her farm, 120 acres of hard-pan dirt she'd inherited from a father who drank more than he plowed, was hemorrhaging money. She had exactly $3,400 in her checking account. It was her survival fund for the winter. Down in the ring, the heavy metal gates clanged open. A collective groan rippled through the bleachers. The handlers drove in lot 42. It was a tragedy in motion. 47 breeding sows shuffled into the sawdust, their heads hanging low, their flanks so sunken you could count every rib. They were covered in scabs, shivering violently in the damp air. A few were limping. They had belonged to a high-volume breeder up in Oakhaven who had gone belly up and left them in a dry lot to starve for 3 weeks before the state stepped in. "All right, boys, what do we have here?" The auctioneer droned, his voice lacking its usual staccato rhythm. He wiped his nose with a handkerchief. "Lot 42, cull sows. Most of them are empty. Some might be bred, but don't count on it. Good for dog food, maybe sausage if you can find some meat on 'em. Let's start the bidding at 10 cents a pound." 10 cents. Silence. Men shifted in their seats. Nobody wanted to waste grain on walking skeletons heading into a bitter winter. 10 cents, the auctioneer repeated, sounding bored. "Come on, 8 cents. Who gives me 8 cents? Cora leaned forward, resting her forearms on her knees. She didn't look at the scabs or the protruding hips. She looked at their frames. They had long, straight backs, deep chests, and large, flopping ears that obscured their eyes. They weren't modern, fast-growing white pigs bred for confinement. These were old genetics, a messy, undocumented cross of Tamworth and Berkshire. Foragers, survivors. She felt the heavy stare of Harlan, the local loan officer, sitting 2 rows down. He knew exactly what was in her bank account. 5 cents, the auctioneer sighed. "Do I hear 5 cents a pound?" Cora raised her yellow plastic paddle. The movement caught the auctioneer by surprise. He blinked, adjusted his microphone, and pointed. "Got 5 cents in the 3rd row. Do I hear 6? He didn't. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed off the concrete. "Sold to number 82. Laughter rippled through the stands. A few men shook their heads. Harlan turned around, offering a tight, pitying smile. "You buying a graveyard, Cora?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. "You don't have the feed to get them through December." "Worry about your own ledgers, Harlan," Cora said, her voice flat. She stood up, shoved her frozen hands deep into her pockets, and walked down the metal stairs. Writing the check felt like pulling a tooth. The final tally, by weight, came out to just over $2,000. That left her with $1,400 to keep 47 starving, half-wild animals alive until spring. Loading them was a nightmare of slipped hooves and terrified squeals. The sleet had turned to freezing rain, coating the aluminum floor of her borrowed cattle trailer in black ice. By the time the last sow was coaxed up the ramp, Cora was soaked to the bone, her hands raw and bleeding from gripping icy aluminum gates. The drive back to Bitter Creek took 2 hours. The heater in her old Ford F250 was broken, blowing nothing but lukewarm dust into the cab. Every time she hit a pothole, she felt the heavy, uncoordinated shifting of the animals in the back. It was a terrifying sensation. If they panicked and piled up, the weaker ones at the bottom would suffocate before she even pulled into her driveway. She arrived at the farm long after dark. The security light on the telephone pole flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow over the barren yard. The outbuildings were leaning, the paint peeled back like dead skin. Unloading them into the old dairy barn was a grim task. The sows stumbled down the ramp, disoriented and exhausted. They didn't explore. They didn't root. They just collapsed into the deep straw Cora had laid down earlier that morning, piling together in massive, shivering heaps to share whatever body heat they had left. Cora stood in the doorway, the harsh wind whipping her wet hair across her face. She listened to their shallow, ragged breathing. She had bet her entire livelihood on a hunch. If these pigs died, she lost the farm. It was that simple. There was no safety net, no government bailout for a stubborn woman in a dying town. She turned off the lights, plunged into the freezing dark, and started walking toward the feed silo. She had work to do. The first 2 weeks were a slow, brutal war of attrition. You don't just throw raw field corn at a starving pig. Their stomachs shrink, their digestive enzymes shut down. Give them too much, or the wrong thing, and the shock will kill them faster than the starvation. Cora knew this. So, she became a rough-hewn alchemist. Her days started at 4 in the morning, the air so cold it felt like broken glass in her lungs. She dragged heavy cast-iron pots onto a propane burner in the barn's tack room, boiling down cracked oats, molasses, and powdered milk replacement. She spent hours stirring the thick, sweet-smelling sludge with a wooden paddle until her shoulders screamed. She bucketed the warm mash into the troughs twice a day. The sows were cautious at first. Then they were ravenous. Nature is ruthless, and Cora's cynicism told her not to expect miracles. On day 4, she walked into the barn and found one of the smaller sows stiff in the corner. On day 9, another one succumbed to a respiratory infection, her lungs giving out despite the antibiotics Cora had painstakingly administered. Dragging 400 pounds of dead weight out of the barn with a tractor chain was a sobering reality check. Cora didn't cry. She just hooked up the chain, put the tractor in low gear, and hauled the carcasses out to the back pasture for the coyotes. 2 lost, 45 left. By mid-December, the surviving herd stabilized. The scabs began to heal, leaving patches of coarse, rust-colored and black hair. The hollows in their flanks started to fill, and as their health returned, so did their true nature. They stopped huddling in fear and began tearing up the frozen dirt in the exercise paddock, rooting with aggressive, single-minded focus. It was during one of these frantic rooting sessions that Emmett pulled into her driveway. Emmett was 70, a retired butcher who still processed deer for the locals out of his garage. He had a face like a dried apple, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He leaned against the rusty fencing, a cigarette dangling from his lips, watching the sows tear through the frost-hardened earth. "Hear you bought the dog food lot," Emmett said, not looking at her. "News travels fast when there's nothing else to talk about," Cora replied, leaning on a pitchfork. Emmett squinted through the smoke. "They ain't dog food, Cora." "I know. Look at the slope of that snout." He pointed a gnarled finger at a massive red sow aggressively tossing chunks of frozen mud. "Look at the ear set. That's a heavy dose of mangalitsa mixed in there. Maybe some old line Tamworth. They don't make them like that anymore. Commercial guys hate 'em. They grow too slow. They put on too much fat. That's exactly why I bought them, Cora said. Emmett finally looked at her, a glimmer of respect in his rheumy eyes. Fat is flavor, girl. But you can't finish them on cheap corn. You feed them garbage, you'll get garbage meat. He was right. And it was the very problem keeping Cora awake at night. Her funds were entirely depleted. She couldn't afford the high-protein finishing feeds required to make the meat exceptional. But what she lacked in cash, she made up for in desperate ingenuity. If they were foragers, she would let them forage. She spent the next month striking deals no sane farmer would bother with. She drove her rattling truck to the local dairy and convinced them to pump their wasteway into a massive plastic tote in her truck bed for pennies on the dollar. She bartered mending fences for the rights to scavenge a derelict apple orchard 3 towns over, spending agonizing weekends hauling crates of rotting, frost-bitten cider apples back to her farm. The diet was unorthodox: sour whey, bruised apples, boiled oats, and whatever roots and acorns they dug up from the 10 acres of scrub oak she fenced off behind the barn. The transformation was astonishing. By March, the sows were majestic. They were thick and muscular, their winter coats dense and gleaming. They moved with a heavy, confident grace. And then, the real chaos began. The auctioneer had guessed some might be bred. He was wrong. All of them were bred. The farrowing started in late April. For 3 weeks, Cora barely slept. She practically lived in the farrowing stalls, armed with iodine, heat lamps, and a thermos of black coffee. The sows, previously half dead and neglected, proved to be fierce, attentive mothers. They built massive nests of straw, groaning heavily as they birthed litter after litter. By the end of May, the farm was a deafening ocean of squeals. Cora stood leaning against the barn door one evening, mud on her face, boots caked in manure, looking out at the paddocks. 45 sows had produced 382 piglets. She did the math in her head. 382 mouths to feed. 382 bodies that would grow to 300 pounds each by the following autumn. It was an impossible logistical nightmare. Her gaze drifted past the paddocks, toward the edge of the property where the tree line met the creek. Sitting there, swallowed by wild blackberry brambles, was a massive, field stone building. It had been her great-grandfather's smokehouse, unused for 60 years. The roof was partially caved in, and the iron door was rusted shut. Cora pushed herself off the doorframe and started walking toward the brambles. She didn't just have pigs anymore. She had a mountain of premium, heritage breed meat walking around her pasture. Selling them on the hoof at the commodity auction would be a waste of everything she'd built. She ripped a thorny blackberry vine away from the heavy iron latch of the smokehouse. Her hands bled, but she didn't feel it. She yanked the latch, the metal shrieking in protest as the heavy door swung open, revealing the dark, cavernous interior, smelling of ancient ash and damp earth. She wasn't going to sell live pigs. She was going to sell something no one in this county had tasted in 100 years. Rebuilding the Fieldstone smokehouse was an exercise in pure stubbornness. The mortar had turned to sand over the decades, and the cedar roof trusses were rotted through, collapsing under the weight of wet autumn leaves and neglect. Cora didn't have the money for contractors. She had her own 2 hands, a rented masonry saw, and a teenager named Toby from the neighboring property who needed cash to fix his transmission. They started in June. The summer heat was suffocating, baking the mud of the paddocks into concrete. Toby mixed mortar in a plastic wheelbarrow, while Cora stood on a rickety aluminum ladder, chiseling out the dead joints between the massive field stones. Her knuckles were constantly scraped raw, the cuts filled with grey dust that stung like hornets. Every time she swung the mallet, she felt the vibration radiate all the way up to her collarbone. "You're crazy, you know that?" Toby muttered one afternoon, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of a filthy work glove. He was looking out at the pasture, where 382 pigs were wallowing in the mud, growing larger by the day. "Crazy doesn't pay the property taxes, Toby. Just hand me the trowel," Cora replied, not looking down. By August, the walls were solid. By September, they had framed a new roof and laid down ribbed tin sheets. Inside, the space was cathedral-like in its acoustics, smelling of damp earth and old ghosts. Cora spent a week power-washing the ancient stone curing vats lining the walls. She drove out to the lumber mill in the next county, trading 2 cords of split oak for a truckload of green hickory slabs. The pigs, meanwhile, were reaching monstrous proportions. The diet of sour whey, bruised apples, and foraged acorns had done exactly what Emmett predicted. They were heavy, broad-shouldered, and coated in thick layers of hard white fat. They didn't look like the lean, uniform animals bred for supermarket styrofoam trays. They looked medieval. When the first hard frost hit in November, exactly 1 year after she had bought the emaciated sows, it was time. She called Emmett. The old butcher arrived in his battered station wagon, dragging a custom-welded processing rig behind him. He didn't come alone. He brought 2 of his nephews, quiet men with thick forearms and dull eyes, who worked with mechanical efficiency. Processing day was not romantic. It was loud, bloody, and brutally exhausting. The cold air hung thick with the metallic scent of copper and the sharp smell of boiling water. Cora didn't flinch. She worked shoulder to shoulder with the men, scraping hides, hoisting heavy carcasses onto the gambrels, and breaking the animals down into primal cuts. "Look at this," Emmett said softly, running a bare hand over a split side of pork hanging from the steel rail. The meat was a deep, vibrant ruby red, heavily marbled with thick ribbons of stark white fat. "You can't fake this. This takes time. This takes walking." Cora wiped a streak of blood from her cheek with the back of her wrist. She felt a profound, heavy ache in her lower back. But looking at the meat, a fierce spark of vindication flared in her chest. Moving the cuts to the smokehouse was a tactical operation. Cora had maxed out a high-interest credit card, 22% APR, a financial death sentence if she failed, to buy hundreds of pounds of coarse sea salt, unrefined brown sugar, black peppercorns, and heavy curing nets. She spent 3 sleepless days and nights in the freezing stone building. She aggressively rubbed the hams, bellies, and jowls with the salt mixture, packing them tightly into the stone vats to draw out the moisture. The physical toll was immense. Her hand swelled from the salt, the skin cracking and bleeding, stinging with a constant, low-grade fire. She wrapped her fingers in electrical tape and kept working. After the initial cure, the hanging began. The ceiling of the smokehouse vanished behind a forest of meat. Massive, teardrop-shaped hams, thick slabs of belly for bacon, rolled collars for copper, and heavy jowls for guanciale. Then came the fire. Cora built the smudge in the center of the dirt floor, using the green hickory slabs. The goal wasn't heat. The goal was smoke. For the next 30 days, she lived in a state of hypervigilance. She woke up every 2 hours, pulling on her boots over her pajamas, and walked out into the freezing night to check the fire. If it burned too hot, the meat would cook and spoil. If it went out, the damp air would invite mold. She learned the language of the smoke. A thick, white billow meant the wood was too wet, producing bitter creosote. She needed a thin, pale blue ribbon of smoke. Sweet, fragrant, and steady. She smelled like a campfire permanently. Her clothes, her hair, even her sweat carried the heavy, intoxicating aroma of hickory and cured fat. In town, people noticed. When she walked into the hardware store to buy hinges for the smokehouse door, the cashier wrinkled his nose. Harlan, the loan officer, happened to be standing by the register. "Burning trash out there, Cora?" Harlan asked, jingling the change in his pocket. "Or did one of those mutt pigs finally catch fire?" Cora looked at him. Her eyes were sunken, ringed with dark purple shadows from sleep deprivation. She placed a crumpled $20 bill on the counter. "I'm curing," she said simply. "Curing what?" Harlan scoffed. "Nobody pays for farm-slaughtered meat anymore. The packers have it locked down. You're wasting your time. Keep your eyes on your ledgers, Harlan." Cora repeated her words from a year ago. She picked up her bag of hinges, turned, and walked out into the cold air. The trap was set. She just had to wait for the spring to spring it. Winter gave way to a muddy, hesitant spring. Inside the smokehouse, the alchemy was reaching its quiet climax. The hams had shrunk, their exteriors turning a dusty, mottled grey-brown, tight and hard to the touch. The bellies had taken on the colour of polished mahogany. The scent inside the stone walls was no longer just raw smoke. It was complex, deep, and intoxicating. It smelled of earth, roasted nuts, sweet salt, and thyme. Cora had precisely $80 left to her name. Her property taxes were past due, and the bank had sent the first warning letter regarding the foreclosure process. She didn't panic. She went to the local library, logged onto their painfully slow computer, and created a rudimentary website. She didn't use flowery adjectives. She listed the breed history, the diet, weigh apples and acorns, and the aging process. Then she spent her final $40 placing small, classified ads in 3 culinary magazines based out of the city, 2 hours east. Heritage pork, acorn finished, hardwood smoked, Bitter Creek Farm, gates open, Saturday, 7 a.m., cash only. She didn't know if anyone would come. The locals thought she was a lunatic running a feral hog operation. The city people had never heard of Bitter Creek. Friday night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the porch in the dark, a loaded shotgun resting against the railing, listening to the peepers in the creek. The air was crisp. Behind the barn, the smokehouse stood like a silent vault. At 5:30 in the morning, the sky still a bruised purple, she saw the first pair of headlights turn off the county highway onto her gravel road. Cora stood up. She pulled on her canvas coat and walked down the driveway. It wasn't a local pickup truck. It was a sleek, black Mercedes SUV. It rolled to a stop by the cattle gate. A man in an expensive wool peacoat stepped out, holding a thermos of coffee. He looked around at the leaning outbuildings and the muddy yard. "You the farmer?" he asked, his breath pluming in the air. "I'm looking for the Mangalitsa cross." "You found it," Cora said. "I'm Cora. Gates open at 7. "I'm David, executive chef at the Marrow in the city," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "A buddy of mine runs a butchery blog. Said he tracked down a lady feeding whey and acorns to old-world pigs. I thought he was full of it. He wasn't." By 6:15, there were 4 more cars. By 6:45, the line stretched down the driveway and spilled out onto the county road. There were refrigerated delivery vans, luxury sedans, and a few battered farm trucks belonging to curious locals who had seen the commotion and pulled over. Cora unlatched the heavy iron gate at exactly 7. She had set up a staging area just outside the smokehouse. Emmett, wearing a pristine white apron over his flannel shirt, stood behind a massive butcher block, holding a slicing knife that gleamed in the morning sun. "All right," Cora addressed the crowd. There were easily 60 people milling about, stamping their feet in the frost. "No haggling. The prices are on the chalkboards. Emmett will slice a sample if you need it." David, the chef, was first in line. He pointed to a massive, dark-cured ham hanging from a hook. "Cut into that one," he instructed Emmett. Emmett laid the ham on the block. He took his knife and drew it cleanly through the meat. The interior was stunning. The meat was the color of dark cherries, bordered by 3 inches of pure, translucent white fat that instantly began to glisten in the ambient air. Emmett handed David a paper-thin slice on a piece of butcher paper. The crowd went completely silent. David lifted the slice, studying the light shining through the fat. He placed it in his mouth, closed his eyes, and chewed slowly. The fat didn't leave a greasy film. It melted instantly, flooding his palate with the sweet, nutty flavor of acorns and the sharp, clean bite of hardwood smoke. He opened his eyes and looked at Cora. The skepticism was entirely gone. "I'll take the whole leg," David said, his voice quiet. "And 4 bellies, and whatever guanciale you have left." The frenzy began. The line never stopped moving. Men in tailored suits shoved cash into Cora's hands, terrified the inventory would run out before they reached the block. Local farmers, the same men who had laughed at her in the auction bleachers a year and a half ago, bought thick slabs of bacon, muttering apologies under their breath when they tasted the fat. Around noon, a familiar silver sedan pulled into the yard. Harlan stepped out, looking bewildered at the chaotic scene. People were walking back to their cars carrying brown paper packages wrapped in twine like they were holding gold bullion. Harlan bypassed the line and walked up to Cora's folding table. The metal cash box was overflowing with $100 bills. "Cora," Harlan said, blinking rapidly. "What in the hell is going on here?" Cora looked up from writing a receipt. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply reached into the cash box, pulled out a thick stack of banded bills, and slid them across the table. "That's the property tax, with the late fees," she said flatly. She pulled out another stack. "That's the principal on the mortgage for the next 6 months. You can take it back to the bank now, Harlan. You're blocking the line." Harlan stared at the money, then at the massive crowd, then back at Cora. He opened his mouth, closed it, picked up the cash, and walked away in silence. By 3 in the afternoon, the smokehouse was empty. Cora sat alone on an overturned bucket in the dirt. The farm was quiet again. The 382 pigs were gone, traded for a staggering sum of money that sat in a canvas bag by her feet. It was enough to fix the roof of the main barn. It was enough to buy a new tractor. It was enough to never worry about freezing in the dark again. She looked at her hands. They were scarred, rough, and permanently stained with ash. She took a deep breath, smelling the lingering ghost of hickory smoke in the air, and stood up. She had to call the auction house. She needed to buy some more dog food. Cora's gamble wasn't a miracle. It was a grueling, dirty war fought with sweat, ash, and an unrelenting refusal to lose. She looked at a pen of starving, forgotten animals and saw a legacy waiting to be forged in stone and smoke. It proves that the greatest value is often hidden beneath the heaviest layers of dirt. If you were captivated by Cora's grit and this journey into the brutal, beautiful reality of farming, hit that like button, share this story with a friend, and subscribe for more unforgettable tales.